All right, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm just going to take a minute to introduce Emily. Emily Fischer is an assistant professor in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at CSU, and I know that a lot of us know her and worked with her last summer. Her research uses both measurements and modeling approaches to investigate sources of atmospheric trace gases to remote environments. Her current work is on the impact of oil and gas emissions on ground-level ozone production and the role of fires in tropospheric composition. She's also currently leading a really exciting project to improve the recruitment and retention of women in the geosciences. And she might tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I will, if you want me to.
Emily did her PhD at the University of Washington and her postdoc work at Harvard University as a joint NOAA Climate and Global Change Fellow and the Harvard Center for Environment Fellow. And today, Emily is going to tell us about sources and distribution of PAN from both in situ and satellite observations. So, go ahead.
Oh, it's not on yet. Here, I'll turn it on. I kept it off. Okay, it's good. All right, so then I can start. Everyone can hear everywhere. All right, great. Thanks so much for having me today. So I'm going to talk today about two projects that I have, and they're both pan-centric. So I'll first talk about some satellite work that I'm doing with primarily with Vivian Payne at JPL. And then because I'm in Colorado and I couldn't not talk about it here, I'll talk about some very preliminary results. And I wouldn't even call them results from FRAPPÉ, probably more present to you the data that we just finalized last week, actually, for PAN and PPN. So in the last minute, I decided that I should include my standard introduction for PAN. So if you're an atmospheric chemist, you can ignore the next 3 slides. And if you're not, then this is for you. So PAN is fascinating to me because it bridges space, time, and chemistry to move pollution. So in certain parts of the world, the air is very dirty, and in certain parts of the world, the air is very clean. And PAN is the species, or one of the species, that can bridge both very long distances and very long times, depending on the time of the year. So PAN, as a reminder, PAN is the route for NOx to reach the remote troposphere. So here's a standard figure from Daniel Jacobs' book and that I use in class. And so PAN is formed in the same type of complex photochemistry that forms ozone. There's 2 sets of precursors. Almost any VOC can serve as a PAN precursor, but the yields vary quite a lot, and I'll talk about that later. Main sources of NOx in the atmosphere: fossil fuel combustion, biomass burning, lightning, and soils. Once PAN is formed, its lifetime is highly temperature dependent. So in this room, PAN has a lifetime on the order of an hour, and outside right now, it probably has a lifetime on the order of about 1.5 months or so, maybe 2 months. It's pretty cold today. So if you form PAN in a polluted source region, and I'll link next to fires and lightning, but if you form PAN and it gets lofted out of the boundary layer, or during summer, or right now, it just moves in our sort of cold atmosphere. If it were to move somewhere and then warm up, and that air mass were to start to warm up, that PAN would break down, and you release this NO2, and you start ozone production. So PAN is the way, as a reminder, that we move NOx from very concentrated locations in terms of location, or in terms of time, in terms of like lightning emissions, to the remote atmosphere. And most of the atmosphere is NOx limited with respect to ozone production. So PAN is linked to the oxidants and to global oxidant distributions on a variety of spatial and temporal timescales. So PAN, that's what you see in a textbook view. PAN also couples biogenic emissions to the nitrogen cycle. So isoprene is a major PAN precursor or major PA radical precursor, lightning NOx. And so in the tropics, this is what PAN production, I think, looks like. So you have really a cascade of isoprene oxidation products that get lofted into a region of the atmosphere where you may have a NOx source aloft, and PAN would have a very long lifetime there. PAN also extends the air quality impacts of fires. So fires have a lot of very short-lived VOCs. A lot of them are oxygenated VOCs. And pan is the way that we think that fires impact ozone production in remote regions. So the problem is that pan is really a thorn in the side of the modeling community. And Lisa and I were talking about this, and I took out her example here because I put in my other intro. So, but here's one example from Mount Bachelor. This is my PhD measurements, and this is pan, and these are data points for 3 years from Mount Bachelor. And this is, the red line here is one individual model comparison that does pretty well in terms of reproducing the seasonal cycle and the quantity of pan that we measure. And then the gray here shows you the range of models in this HTAP intercomparison. So the models can often be off for this species by sometimes a factor of 2 to 4, but then ozone will be right or compare well. So what I'm going to do today is use the global model development work that I've done as the introduction to this talk, and explain to you sort of why, or making the new satellite measurements, and why I think we do need more ground-based observations of pan right now. So I'm really using this model work as a way to develop questions and hypotheses. And then I'll talk about the new test retrievals and what we're starting to see in them, and I can answer questions about the tropics too, because that's the other region of the world that we've processed some data for. And then I'll end with a little bit at FRAPPÉ, and I might cut that a little bit short, and I can spend 3 slides or so talking about the Women in Geoscience project, because I would love to have collaboration from you. All right, so as we start this introduction on pan, and from the model simulation side of things, I just want to introduce to you the kinds of things that I've played around with in a global chemical transport model. Not that these are everything that impacts pan, but this is sort of what I have built an intuition around, because this is what I've messed with in GSChem. So GSChem, global chemical transport model, used by a lot of different people. It's definitely a research model with constantly changing parameterizations of things. And the kinds of things, when I started at Harvard, the kinds of things that I worked on to try to improve the pan simulation, or try to improve the model's ability to reproduce the global suite of aircraft observations, kind of fell into 2 categories. So one side was to improve non-methane VOC budgets, and the other side was to change the way fire emissions are incorporated and see what that does to pan. So I played with changing the isoprene oxidation scheme, following Fabien Pelot's work. I added emissions of aromatics and changed methyl glyoxal yields. I updated budgets for ethane and propane. These, I think, are still quite bad. And I spent a lot of time on acetone exchange with the ocean. And I also added a representative lump terpene oxidation scheme. And I think all of these things are quite important for pan. And then on the fire side of things, I changed a little bit the way fire emissions are injected. In the standard version of GSChem, they all go into the boundary layer. And then to sort of shortcut around the fast fire chemistry that happens, I immediately partitioned 40% of fire NOx to pan. And I added, sort of in line with this, added emissions of some shorter-lived VOCs, and then increased emissions in certain regions to account for undetected small fires. And I think that's actually quite a large issue for pan now that I see what the satellite data is showing us. So this is the major features of the global pan distribution is what I want to talk about next. So before I do that, let me explain this plot to you. So here is different altitude bins. Here's the surface, here's the mid-troposphere, and let's call the upper troposphere. And here's 4 seasons. And the background is GSChem for year 2008. And the circles are aircraft observations from many different NASA campaigns, averaged over different boxes. And if you can't see the circles, that's kind of the point, actually. The model is doing a pretty good job. This updated model is doing a pretty good job of capturing some bigger features in the data. So the big features that pop out for pan when you look at a global distribution are a northern hemisphere springtime maximum, and this is something that we've known about for a long time. This is pan production and photochemistry happening at a time when pan's thermal lifetime is long. There's a pan reservoir aloft during northern hemisphere summer. I'm going to show you that on the next slide, and what's, I think, very exciting about that is you can, I think, see that in the test data. And there's another feature is an austral spring maximum, and I won't talk about that too much today. I'll spend a lot more time in the northern hemisphere today. But the austral springtime maximum, we also are seeing in multiple years in the test data, which is kind of fun. So here's another look at this global distribution of this species. So here's mean pan, 30 north to 60 north, and here's longitude. So, and there's two seasons. Here's summer and spring in the northern hemisphere. And here are our big anthropogenic source regions. So this is where the US sits, this is Europe, and this is East Asia. And so what you can see that for pan, the loss rate, which is quite fast in summer at the surface in the northern hemisphere compared to aloft, impact the vertical structure, which for pan we think creates this reservoir aloft at northern mid-latitudes. And you can see that if you look at, this is a major feature if you look at aircraft campaigns like Topsy or something, and you can see that feature start to pick up in spring. But it looks like in late spring. But you can see it, the model really, I think, shows that in a way that there's probably this reservoir of pan from late spring to early summer, maybe to mid-fall, that is sort of floating around above the surface. So you have a springtime surface maximum and a maximum aloft. And I think we see this, or at least we see the seasonality in the test data. So we see that spring to summer transition with more pan actually aloft. So in learning about pan in the use of using a global model, this is something that this graph and the things I'm about to show you are really what started to frame some of the questions that I'm working on now. So I want to spend some time on this result because it was really surprising to me. So this is the sensitivity study where I just did something very simple to demonstrate this idea. So I took separately knocked down VOC emissions across all sectors by 20% and separately knocked down NOx emissions by 20%, and then looked at the response of the total column of pan to those types of perturbations. And then here's the sensitivity of pan. So what's here that I think is interesting is a superlinear response, especially for the VOCs. So pan is incredibly, in the model world at least, pan is incredibly sensitive to VOC budgets. And so what happens is if you decrease your VOCs, or if you change your VOCs, you decrease your VOCs, you'll drop your pan production in a given region. Where pan is the primary source of NOx in the atmosphere, which is a lot of the atmosphere, where it's a very large part of the NOx source. Where you do that, then you drop your ozone. When you drop your ozone, then you change your NO2 to NO ratio, and you essentially then further drop your lifetime of pan. So in that way, so after doing, this is sort of an intuition that I had built by playing with the VOC budgets, but this is essentially what's happening. So pan is incredibly sensitive to VOCs, and VOC budgets are something that is, I think, one weak aspect of global models, and pan is very relevant for the global atmosphere. So I spent some time, and I'll try and walk you through it today. Where does pan come from in a global sense? So here is global PA radical production. And pan production, at least in GeoChem, primarily comes through four different pathways, but we're going to focus on three. So the intermediate species are acetaldehyde, acetone, and methyl glyoxal. And then there's other intermediates, which are primarily other isoprene oxidation products that are not methyl glyoxal. So these are the global sources for acetaldehyde, acetone, and methyl glyoxal. So these are their global budgets. So orange is atmospheric formation, marine biogenic is blue, terrestrial biogenic is green, and then the red sliver is primary anthropogenic. So these are sort of complicated global budgets for this global budget. And the orange up here tells you how the primary emissions contribute to the formation of these immediate precursors. So what you can see is that there's a whole diversity of primary emissions that contribute to pan, and they primarily go, in the atmospheric formation at least in the model, through acetaldehyde, and if you're isoprene, then through methyl glyoxal. So where this matters, where each of these matter in a global sense, or maybe we should move to a more local sense, depends on two things. It depends on their sources and the lifetimes of these different precursors. So here's a map of the organic part of the organic formation, so the PA radical production, the organic half of the pan molecule, as a function of altitude. So here, and species. So here's the boundary layer, here's middle troposphere, and here's way up high. And here are the different compounds. So for methylglyoxal, that is primarily from isoprene, right? And methylglyoxal has a lifetime of under 2 hours. So it really matters for pan production if you're near a lot of isoprene, or if you're relatively low in the atmosphere and on the continents. So acetone, which I have lots to say about this budget because I still think my budget's still wrong, but acetone has a much longer lifetime, on the order of half a month. So it's actually not that important for pan production. That's, I think, a pretty major conclusion when we try to justify learning about acetone. Maybe learning about pan is not the way to do it. Learning about global H budget probably is. So an acetaldehyde has this sort of sweet spot. Well, its lifetime is just shy of a day, and it has precursors that range from ethane, which has a lifetime of 2 months, down to other species which have lifetimes on the order of days. So it makes the largest contribution overall to pan production. And these are other isoprene oxidation products which behave a lot like in the model like methylglyoxal, so the map looks the same. So this is how you form, in the global sense, this half of the pan molecule. So for the northern hemisphere, or the northern mid-latitudes, where we live, the picture looks a little bit different and varies by season. So this is these are the primary emissions. So here, back here, we're looking at the immediate precursors. And here are the primary emissions perspective. So here's the contribution of primary emissions to the pan burden in northern mid-latitudes, so 30 to 60 north in spring and summer. And you can probably guess my color scheme here. Again, blue is, green. So green is, it's the afternoon, my dumbest time of the day. Green is biogenic, red is anthropogenic, and blue and gray are things that are mixed or with complicated budgets, like you saw the acetaldehyde budget on the last one. So in springtime, alkanes are very important precursors for pan on a global sense, or in places where there is relatively little isoprene. So that's what we would expect. So making these figures is what has sort of motivated my interest in making new measurements of pan in oil and gas producing regions. So here's the same picture, the same Jacob picture of a polluted source region and pan formation. And if you're sitting in a place where you have a lot of precursors of species that we know form acetaldehyde, or specifically the light alkanes, when they form acetone, could this sort of large input of light hydrocarbons shift NLY partitioning towards pan and other organic nitrates, effectively extending the NOx lifetime, right? So if you go into geochem and you know that your ethane and propane budgets are way off, and we just also discussed that earlier today, and you play simple games, multiplying them by a factor of 2 or something, then you do see this happening. You do see the shift towards pan, nitric acid goes down, and your sort of lumped alkyl nitrate also goes up. So this is how I'm, in addition to understanding ozone production, in a global sense, my motivation for doing more pan measurements to see if we are able to observe this. All right. So the motivation for the new satellite measurements start here. So here is the sensitivity to pan in terms of emissions classes. So here's anthropogenic emissions, biomass burning, and lightning. And here is spring, summer, and fall. So keep in mind that the in situ observations that we have are probably too sparse to get at interannual variability and trends and seasonality in a lot of parts of the world. But these are some other questions. These are some big questions that I'm hoping we're able to do with the satellite measurements. So here, what is the seasonality of pan export for North American ozone? So Anthropogenic emissions matter a lot in the northern hemisphere, and they matter, and we see some seasonality here. So what is it? Keep in mind that the measurements downwind of East Asia from aircraft have only happened in certain months. So what are the major features of pan in the tropics? And are they driven by biomass burning or lightning? And then what I'm working on right now is how are the seasonal cycle and interannual variability of pan at northern latitudes connected to boreal fires? Because when I made these sort of attribution plots, what I found most surprising was the relatively small role that fires play. If you sort of look at aircraft data, always there's high pan in fires, and we spend a lot of time flying around in fires. But when you look at a global modeling sense, the place where fires actually seem to matter for the global pan distribution are springtime, and the fires are in northern Eurasia at that time. So this is, so I'll talk about this today. Vivian Payne is leading this part of the analysis, and John Warden and his postdoc are leading that top part of the analysis. All right, so this is my new satellite observations from TESS, my full disclosure slide. And so Helen can jump in if she has more disclosure to do. So TESS is sensitive to pan in the mid to upper troposphere. There is no information on the vertical. There's a relatively high detection limit of 0.2 ppb. And so, and that depends on the atmospheric conditions and the ground. But basically what that means is TESS only sees elevated pan. The estimated errors are large. Their impact of clouds is variable with to the best of my understanding. When there's a large enough pan signal, TESS will see it with and without clouds. If there's a borderline pan signal, it may be obscured by clouds. So there are other satellite pan measurements. For limb observations, climatologies exist. For nadir observations, the published work has primarily been limited to biomass burning plumes. And essentially, everything that we're doing with TESS, we think could be done with EASI. So I've been working with Vivian Payne, and what she did was take the GSChem pan simulation and use it to develop 6 a priori profiles. And so the GSChem pan simulation, of which I've just kind of told you I think is problematic, is actually the basis for the satellite observations. So it's time consuming to process this data, and so we're going basically region by region and processing the data so that we can move forward with the analysis rather than processing the whole globe and the whole test data set at the same time. So we focused on the East Asian export region for multi-year retrieval processing. So what we've done so far is processed this, basically, if you can't see from the back here, this is the Asian coastline, and this is the North American West Coast. So we've processed this region for April and July. And the reason why is because I thought, well, if we can't see interesting things here in the East Asian export region, then we're not going to see them anywhere. And also, this is a region with these fires, and I keep getting back to this fire question. I'm wondering, I wanted to learn more about this, and when I was a grad student sitting at Mount Bachelor, I remember the most pan I ever observed was from fires in this region. So I said, Vivian, let's do April and July first for this region. So this is an example of the retrieval. And these dots here represent the average pan from 800 hectopascals to the tropopause. And each dot basically represents a successful retrieval, which Vivian doesn't like me to use the word successful retrieval, but I don't remember what I'm supposed to say instead. Is there a successful retrieval, so pans above detection limit, and the average is represented in the troposphere is represented by the scale. And these are all the points that we have for April 2008. So every month, we're producing a map like this, essentially. And alongside this, we have carbon monoxide and ozone retrievals, right? But there's going to be a lot more CO and ozone than there is of pan. So if you look at this region of the world. So here's Lake Baikal, here's, this is basically eastern Siberia, and this is the month of April. So there's variable amounts of data and variable amounts of pan in that data. But what you can see here is that there are more dots in 2006 and 2008. So there's more successful retrievals, and those retrievals are more warmer colors in those two seasons. And so what we're trying to do now is figure out, is this a real signal in the atmosphere, and what's driving it? So, not to give it away, but so here is a summary of these areas. So, and I'm going to walk through this kind of slowly so you can see all the components. So here is year. So this is April 2006 to 2010. The box plot here is the distribution of the tropospheric average pan and ppb. So this is just those dots put into a box plot. And what you can see is that there's more pan. This is the maximum and the mean of that distribution in 2006 and 2008. And if you were to compare it to 2007, compare 2008 to 2007, for example, that's a factor of 2 about different. So red here shows you the attempted observations. So TESS makes special observations. So there were field campaigns going on in 2006 and 2008. So there were more observations actually taken in those regions than compared to 2007, and that's the red line here. The blue is the successful pan detection. So the first thing to see about the blue is these are really low numbers in terms of successful attempts. But that's also higher in certainly in 2008 compared to 2007, and 2006 compared to 2007. So the first thing that we had to do is try and make sure that the special observations are not biasing the sample. But with the special observations removed, the means are the same. So here's that same figure, except I've changed the number of attempted observations to take out the special observations. So here, there's a similar number of attempts now for these 3 years, and you can see that our main conclusion here doesn't really change. And the entire distribution actually doesn't change the way it looks, and they remain similar, and so we think that's actually quite real. So I do think that in this region, there's probably a factor of 2 change when there is a high fire year versus a low fire year for the amount of pan in the atmosphere that we're able to detect. To finish this statistics, to put confidence intervals on it, I'm still working on how we should actually do that. We need degrees of freedom, which what we may end up doing is just dividing our samples by a factor of 2 to be extra conservative, but it's probably not going to change it at all. So what happened during those years? So here is this 2 regions. So here's, I'm backward, I feel backwards all of a sudden, but here's western and an eastern region of Russia. And here are Miser plume heights for April 2008. We just have 1 year. And down here is kind of a strange unit, but it's the total mean radiative power over a 1 by 1 degree grid. So basically adding up all the fires for that month and for the month of April and plotting them for each April for each year. And so 2 things that you can see here are that there was elevated fire activity in this red region in 2006 and in 2008. There are lower plume injection heights on this side. These are more agricultural fires than boreal, sort of typical forests and boreal forests. And on the blue side here, which is the bottom line, there's elevated fire activity in 2008 and these higher plume injection heights. So what we think is that, and so what we're working on now, and as I could present to you, but the figures are quite messy, we ran basically a 4-dimensional trajectories for every pan detection that we have for this entire region, and a lot of them, probably more than half, go back to the fire region. So we are pretty sure that what's driving this signal is fires. Not surprising, but it's sort of the first time we've ever been able to look at interannual variability or look at panda distributions in this part of the world, really. So just to bring it back to the modeling, so this is the GS Chem contribution of biomass burning to pan as a percentage. And so I had done my work, all my calculations in 2008, and in Eastern Russia, GS Chem attributes a very large amount of pan to biomass burning. In 2006, where we also see in the satellite data quite a lot of pan, GS Chem does not attribute very much of that pan to biomass burning. So and also does not have variability in pan between 2006 and 2007. So the model is missing something about the fires in 2006, whether they're low altitude, they're low fires or they're smaller fires. GFED3 is not getting them. And we think that that's what's actually causing the high pan in the satellite data. So as I said, Western Russia had a lot of fires, and there's some discrepancy in GFED you can see these fires in fire radiative power, but you don't see them in burned areas. So there's some problem that I don't understand. So the preliminary thoughts from the test work is that there is springtime interannual variability in pan at high latitudes, and I think it could be larger, even larger than I thought it could be. First I thought 20% based on my Mount Bachelor work, but the difference between 2007 and 2008 is more on like a factor of 2. Northern region fires are certainly one source of this variability. I haven't looked at temperature and some other things to see what else, but the trajectories all seem to point to fires. It seems like the fires are what's driving it. And GS Chem does not seem to capture all of the observed interannual variability in pan. And I don't have total confidence intervals on everything yet, but I don't think that story is going to change at all. So let me move to talk about FRAPPÉ. So my group made measurements at 2 of the ground sites, at the BAO Tower in Erie, and then at the Rocky Mountain National Park site. So I'll show you some data from both of those. The work at BAO is in collaboration with Delphine Farmer and funded through CDPHE. And then at Rocky Mountain, I just made 1 measurement out of many, and Jeff Collette and Barclay Sive groups were also working there. The students, and I have to thank you very much for having them involved. The CSU atmospheric science students also help with the nowcasting, and this was just really wonderful, actually. And they're faking it in this picture for me. But they were doing this in our forecasting room, and I would come in, and what was really, really nice was these are not the atmospheric chemistry students. Well, this student that crosses both lines, but crosses the dynamics and chemistry. But it was really, really wonderful to have the dynamics students excited in an air quality campaign. So it was just really fun, and I have one of the students who's a second year in one of my classes right now, and I think he liked my class more because he was a help during FRAPPÉ forecasting. So our goals for the BAO measurements were to understand the emissions of oil and gas operations on ozone production, and my group ran the Precurso in the Pisa. I have a picture in a second, and ran Frank's GC in the trailer next to the tower. So you may all know this already, but it is really wonderful to write a proposal to work at BAO, because it is depending on wind direction, you have completely different composition. And this has been demonstrated by some really wonderful work that has shown this. So here's BAO, here are the oil and gas fields, and here's Denver, right? So here's a picture of the Pisa. This is the nicest picture of the campaign, I think, from my perspective, for my talks. And then we had this trailer sitting at the base of the tower. So the methane and the CO and CO2 measurements were sometimes running up and down, and that's kind of a complicated analysis, whereas the pan was always sitting in the same spot. So this is still preliminary data. Nothing is going to change at this point, but I guess I haven't actually put the final non-RA files up yet. So as a reminder, for those of you who don't work on pan, measurements of the pan family can help untangle the contribution of different VOC sources to local ozone formation. That's how that's been used in the past. Or we can't be as knowledgeable as Frank, so here is a reminder of the pan family precursors. So I talked a lot about pan. So any VOC can serve as a precursor for pan, but the yields vary. These are all the peaks I think we see on our chromatogram. And we've only integrated PPN and PAN so far. But so PPN is formed virtually only from anthropogenic VOCs, like longer chain alkenes and alkanes. And PAN is formed from biogenic isoprene oxidation. So, and PIBN, I didn't know that we would see on the chromatograms, but we see it on a couple of different days, I think, where there's 4 peaks. So I'll show you data for PAN and PPN. That's as far as we are in terms of nice data. So here is the time series of PAN from BAO. And here, oh, those colors aren't so great. But what I've put on the top here, if you're red-green colorblind, that's really, really bad, the way this looks right now, huh? So these are the C-130 flight days in the orange color. And this, what looks like a weird light green now, is these are the TESS special observations that were carried out during the campaign. So July 23rd, when every air conditioner was broken, and somehow the PAN GC did not turn off and the computer didn't die. Other computers in the trailer also did not make it. But that's when actually the peak PAN occurred at BAO. But there's quite a few other days with mixing ratios above a ppb. So July 15th, July 23rd, the 29th, August 8th, and August 18th and 19th. So what we've done so far is gone through and just done some very basic things. So that's what I'm going to show you. So here's the PPN to PAN ratio. And then here is, as a percentage, PPN to PAN. So 10%, 15, 20, 25. And all the data basically is in black. And then I overplotted these sort of elevated polluted days in different colors. So if we think about this figure, so here 15% has been observed in areas dominated by anthropogenic VOC NOx chemistry. So when PAN is elevated, we're certainly almost always above that 15% line. And during the sort of the most elevated days, we fall on this 20% line. As you think about this ratio, a higher impact of a larger contribution to PAN formation from anthropogenic VOCs would shift these points this way. And if you had a lot of isoprene, more biogenic VOCs would shift it this way. So we're certainly in our region an anthropogenically dominated chemistry. So this summer, though, the front range ozone abundances were relatively low. So this is measurement days above the maximum 8-hour average ozone, and here's 2014. And so these colors just represent your category for your 8-hour ozone exceedance. So there's actually this 2014 compared to a lot of the years in the past is quite low in terms of high ozone days. But what I've done is gone through and looked at the days when the front range ozone monitors did exceed 75 ppb somewhere this summer. And so there were quite a few days, as many of you know, not a lot, and some of them fell within FRAPPÉ and some of them fell before FRAPPÉ, like the 9th of July. And so here's our time series with the days when the front range ozone monitors exceeded 75 ppb. And here's this same figure, so PPN versus PAN on those days. And what I can say in this sort of preliminary sense is that it looks like there's different chemistry probably on some of the different days, which I think from an analysis perspective will be interesting to try and figure out. I would think that July 9th might be a different VOC mix that's more important than August 13th, for example, if I look at the PPN to PAN ratios. So, and that's literally, this is about where I'm at, but it looks like there's going to be some differences in these types of days based on the PAN chemistry at least. Other features that I'm seeing as I sort of go through and try not to get ahead of my graduate student because I'm so excited about seeing the data, but I see positive afternoon PAN versus methane relationships, positive afternoon PAN over PAN as a fraction of NOI versus methane. And I'm not saying methane is a precursor to PAN, but we don't have other hydrocarbons for that site. So so methane is my wind sector, and chemistry sort of tracer. I'm using it that way. So there's be more to come here as all the final data sets come out. And then we're also doing, and I'll talk about this in a second, just briefly, I'll mention it, a follow-up campaign this spring and a follow-up campaign next summer. All right, so how do these measurements compare to just some others? Here's again that ratio again. Here's the 30 to these different lines, but instead I've colored them by different things. So the highest ratio in Texas, Texacs, I guess, was 25% for reference. This is, again, this 15% areas dominated by anthropogenic VOCs. That was also the average afternoon maximum in Boulder in 1987. It's very nice working here because there's old measurements. And then the green here represents the Niwot Ridge easterly flow in June and July from 1987. So it'll be fun, I think, to go through these and some of the older measurements and see how this ratio might have changed in our region. So the other site that we worked at was Rocky Mountain National Park. There are two things that matter for Rocky Mountain National Park. From an air quality perspective, the elevated ozone and harmful levels of nitrogen deposition. And there actually hadn't been any measurements before this summer, I think, of organic nitrogen species in the park. So in case you haven't been to this site, it's really a lot nicer than BAO. You go up 7, you go past Lily Lake, and then you go past the Longs Peak Lookout, and then you turn into the summer camp, and it's just beautiful. And Sarah Callahan, who was my summer CMAP student, she worked very, very, very hard, but she at least got to hang out somewhere nice. So I'll just show you just a time series of this data. We'll have pan data from a couple days after I set up at BAO, because I did this. This was like the site that went up second. And then I ran actually through September 2nd. I actually ran through September 9th, but somebody bumped into the helium regulator on September 2nd. So we're stopping at that point. But on these, there are, what I have in the red behind here is just the ozone from the Longs Peak from the National Park site, which is right there. And the high ozone days and the high pan days are often the same days for Rocky Mountain National Park. So let me just show you a zoomed-in example. So here's pan and here's ozone, and here is I-pentane and N-pentane, and these were located in a different trailers than the pans. So this is when the air conditioners, they said, all died on the 23rd. But if you look at this I-pentane to N-pentane ratio, which is about 1, I think it's 1.09 or something here and here, 1.07 something here. It looks very similar to what's been observed in Boulder by Jessica Gilman. So maybe between a Fort Collins and Boulder type air mass in terms of that ratio. So as I said, Delphine Farmer and I are doing 2 more campaigns at BAO. And so we'll support the SONGNEX measurements, which are really starting in mid-March, as I was complaining to people about earlier today. And we're very likely to do a follow-up summer campaign this summer with basically the same set of measurements, except we'll be responsible for more of them. And this is part of a larger project to try and understand characteristic ozone production rates and efficiencies in air masses influenced by oil and gas production, reactive nitrogen partitioning in these kinds of air masses in spring versus summer. And then in a global sense, what chemical pathways do these emissions contribute to most efficiently to ozone production? So do I have 3 more minutes to talk about this? All right. So this Women in Science project was supposed to be very small and now is wonderful and large. So we have at CSU a 5-year project to try and improve the recruitment and retention of undergraduate women in the geosciences through deliberate mentoring approaches. And I have this awesome team that I get to work with that includes the CSU STEM Center, a gender psychologist, an educational statistician, and 2 other board members of the Earth Science Women's Network. And I have a team at CSU that includes Melissa Burt, who's the chair of the AMS Committee on Women and Minorities, and also is the CMAP Education and Diversity Manager. And then I have Alana Pollack as my on-the-ground logistics person, which is really wonderful. So what we're doing is trying to design an intervention that has 3 components that will help undergraduate women either come into the geosciences or stay in the geosciences. Because as we understand it, the sort of leaky pipeline starts that early, starts in their first or second year of their undergraduate education. And so what we're going to do, and I'll talk about that in a second, specific to the Front Range, is have 3 components to an intervention. So we are going to invite them to a workshop where they are introduced to the geosciences. They learn about networking. They develop sort of resilience to some of the issues you might face as an undergraduate STEM major as a woman. We're going to have an online aspect to this. So it's basically an online platform where they have access to resources, and they also can chat with each other. So if you're the only woman in your geology class, then you also might know the other woman in the geology class at the University of Wyoming. And then we're going to have long-term mentoring with all different types of women and in a very casual setting over their entire undergraduate careers. And then we are going to have a control group who does not get all of this, and we're going to figure out, does it work? Why does it work? So we have someone who works on statistics for underrepresented groups in science, someone who, CSU STEM Center, so can this work at a public university or not? What needs to be in place? And then why does it work from a psychological perspective? And we're going to track that. So in the Front Range, we have, are getting this up and running. So our first workshop will be October 17th to 18th, 2015. I am taking them to Emily's summer camp at YMCA of the Rockies, which should be quite fun for the weekend. And we're recruiting students from, right now, from the University of Wyoming, CSU, and the University of Colorado in Boulder. So it has to be that big in order to have the numbers, actually, of first and second year students of women in the geosciences, shockingly. So then we're working on this peer mentoring website right now, and we're just starting to take names for anyone who would really like to be involved in the long-term mentoring. So if you are interested in this, please email me, and I would love to have you. And so we're really are just starting this. It would not be a huge time commitment in any way. We'll have training workshops for same gender and specifically for mentoring women at the start of it, and then it would be like taking some undergrads out to coffee once a semester. So, but you're a guinea pig then after that, because we were allowed to study you and your interaction with them. But so this is my new project, and it's very fun, and I'm very excited about it. So that's it. So thanks.
Thanks so much. Do we have any questions? We have about 10 minutes. I move slowly.
Emily, I've just got a quick question about this project right here. How broad are you considering geosciences? Is this just atmospheric science, or
No.
Geology and plate tectonics and all that stuff?
Yes. Because the issues are persistent across all the earth sciences. I mean, really, we could do this for more broadly than even the geosciences. It's probably some of the same issues, but at least we're considering it very broadly. So oceans, volcanoes, biogeochemistry, atmospheric science. This is my field, so I put the bar the biggest over here. So very, very broadly, and actually in recruiting, we have to go to first-year chemistry classes, because that is where a student is if they have this inkling that they are interested in the atmosphere. I was in a first-year chemistry class. That's where I was at that point, right? So it is incredibly broad, and the way it's working logistically is that we are inviting students to take a survey in their first or second year, going into their classroom, inviting them to take a survey about their potential interest in the geosciences. And we put up a word cloud that has atmosphere, ocean, environment, all these different things, pictures of women working together in the field. And then they take that survey, and then we match them. So we have a control group who looks academically just like the group that's going to come to Emily's YMCA of the Rockies weekend. And we'll track those students for 5 years. So it's in some ways a little bit heartbreaking, right? Because there's going to be a really excellent student over in the control group who doesn't get to come. But the mentoring literature in our field is incredible. And I speak broadly about the geosciences. This is very soft, very anecdotal. And so this is the way to do it, is to know if there actually is an effect. But yeah, that's a longer answer. But yeah, it's very, very broad. And the recruiting is going to have to be in non-geoscience classes.
Okay, any other questions?
Emily, how well does geochem model atmospheric measurements? How reliable is it?
It's very dependent on the species. Do you mean for Pan? Or? So I can tell you things that it does pretty well. It does seasonal cycle at surface sites pretty well. It does absolute quantity in a lot of the atmosphere pretty well. Things that I think it's where it's underestimating export from East Asia. The current emissions in the model reproduce the transport out of East Asia as of 2001, 2002. So we know emissions have changed quite a bit during that time period. So it's only as good as what goes into it. The other things where I think the model has discrepancies or are places where rapid vertical transport matters a lot. There's certain places in the tropics where I compare to aircraft observations where if I run GEOS 4 versus GEOS 5 as the underlying meteorology, then you get very different answers for Pan. Actually, I didn't show that, but that's something I've done. It's also quite possible to be getting things right for the wrong reason. So like to try and reproduce the seasonal transition from spring to summer that you see in the topsy measurements where there's a reservoir built aloft from 3 to 6 kilometers for Pan basically from 45 degrees north to 70 degrees north, there's this feature that comes in. Well, I can make that feature occur by changing the way the model handles fires. But I might be able to make that feature occur from changing another type of VOC budget, quite possibly. So it does, I think, a good job in that way, but it's still problematic. So I think there's still quite a few things that could be missing. Does that answer your question? That give you a sense of the range of things, right? That's a global model, so it doesn't do a good job on fire chemistry because it doesn't have any short-lived VOCs in it. So I'm faking the fire chemistry in there right now and trying to figure out a better way to do it.
Hang on just a second. We're recording it, so.
Given that the IASI swath width is much, much wider than TESS,
yeah,
you'd have a lot
Where's
more.
Helen now?
You'd have a lot more data to analyze if you just use the IASI.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what the status of the IASI Pan product is, or if there actually is one, if it's just kind of a purely a research product. But are there any thoughts about using the IASI observations for this kind of work?
Yes. We, in fact, assumed the IASI team would start doing it. Actually, it's something Vivian and I talk about. We're like, well, we should probably do this before IASI does it because they should be able to do a better job in a lot of regions of the atmosphere. So the answer is yes, but I don't really know. We're just getting into this, and it's the analysis. So I'm not going to switch satellite products unless somebody from IASI can help me, in which case I could do the analysis. But
for the long term, there's going to be a much longer IASI data set, with all the series of IASI instruments, so you could potentially produce a much longer record.
Yeah, in theory, we could do everything better with IASI. How this started was Vivian actually emailed me and said, I need your help to do this project. And then I wrote the proposal and said, this is what we're going to look at when you get this data and this kind of stuff. But with IASI, I might be able to come up with a totally different set of science questions, actually. I wonder. Because when I was developing these science questions and deciding, what can we actually do with this data? What can we do with this detection limit and this frequency? And I thought, okay, the only things we can really do are really big picture questions, interannual variability, big scale, maybe fires versus lightning, relative importance in certain places. But maybe with IASI, I could change the kind of questions I could ask, maybe.
Maybe I missed it, but does the model have ppn in it? Or?
It does, but I've ignored it because I don't think there's any way it could capture that chemistry. So, and it's such a smaller fraction. It's 20% of pan at max, right? So we're getting down to a smaller fraction of the reactive nitrogen budget. So it does, and I thought there were so many. The original idea was, oh, you can look at pan, and then you can look at ppn, and then you can and I was like, I don't think that that's worth doing until we spend more time on pan, I think, actually. Even though, yeah, I thought about it, and I thought, I just don't think there's enough chemistry in here, and that's going to require a lot more changes. But it's there. So it's there. You can output it. It's a standard output from GS Chem, actually, which is strange to me, but I don't think anyone ever looks at it, even me.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
As a quick follow-up to that, do you think looking at even just the ratios would be useful? To see if you can see the...
Maybe, but I don't know. I mean, I think about BAO as a different... I don't know if that... I have struggled with this a little bit in thinking about... Right, I'm working on like satellite data and model data and the ground-based data and how to link the ground-based data and the ratios in the model, and I'm not sure they're the right scale of model for working at BAO or something. So I haven't tried that yet, and I don't know. And I don't have any, I literally have not plotted ppn in GS Chem. I mean, I did in the beginning, right, when I didn't know what was going on in the model. Like, oh, we'll use this and we'll use this. And then I was like, oh, we need to understand a lot of this a lot better before I spend a lot of time investing in that ratio. So I hope that someday I can switch species. But I mean, there's also one lumped alkyl nitrate. So like, there's a lot of things that I could get information from, but they're just not really there. Or they're there in some cursory manner for a global model.
All right, one more question.
Could one contributor to the spring maximum be the, say, warm conveyor belts associated with frontal passages lifting surface air into the big troposphere where, say, the pan would be more visible to TESS?
You say to a springtime maximum. So the springtime maximum is primarily a feature of rural air at the surface. What we see in TESS is, like when we look at East Asian export, we see more pan in summer in TESS than in spring, right? And so where TESS is sensitive, above 700 or 800 hectopascals to the tropopause, right? There's not that seasonality that you see at the surface. There's the seasonality that I see in the model with that sort of river of pan floating around. Do you see what I mean? Does that clarify that a little bit? So this springtime surface maximum, which has been observed for a long time, right, at long time surface sites, may be a surface, more of a surface feature actually. And if we think about the seasonality, and I'm not saying that pan is more important in summer versus spring or something like that, that's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying the data shows, because that's sort of a question of, you have to do a lot of model chemistry to say that this is when pan is less important, and it's actually important in different spaces and different times. But this sort of river floating around from the test data that in summer, from the test data we processed so far, that seems to be there. And you wouldn't necessarily know that from the observations that you have, right? Like you could, when you see the observations in the context of the model, like, oh, okay, yeah, of course, there's a maximum aloft, but it looks like it's probably everywhere. At least we see it in the East Asian export crossing the Pacific in summer. But then it has to get to impact surface ozone, then the pan has to get down to the surface again, right? So the sort of efficacy for ozone production may be different, but yeah. Frank, can I just call him Frank?
Yeah, if it's short.
Well, it's just a short.
It'll be my answer. Yeah.
The Thompson data pointed to what the spring maximum can be reduced by the decreasing availability of hydrocarbons with the increasing availability of light.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but the model doesn't get. The model doesn't. Do you mean? Can I draw? You're saying this, right? Just to make sure we're saying the same thing. Going from this is pan, this is altitude. This is what?
No, not just if you look at the surface data.
You're talking about surface data. Yeah, you're talking about surface data. I was, yeah.
For Topsy was really, the model really showed that, and observation showed that too, the hydrocarbons are going down as the sun comes up, and the sun comes up, and there's a maximum somewhere.
Yeah.
April is about right.
And I'm saying for Topsy, there's this is February, and this is May for a vertical profile average. And the model has a hard time getting this transition. I don't know the surface. The surface was not what I was thinking of. I was actually thinking of this shape transition from the model. That's a major feature, and the model has a hard time getting that. And one way to get it, is springtime fires at northern latitudes. But there could be other things that it's missing. But this is a transition that the model's having a hard time getting.
Okay, more discussion can be done following the seminar, but let's thank Emily one more time.